the forgotten conflicts and unanswered questions at America's birth. It begins not with a declaration, but with silence. A profound and deliberate quiet settled over the final draft of a document intended to give voice to a new nation. On September 17, 1787, as the last of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia affixed their signatures to the parchment, the air in the assembly room of the Pennsylvania State House was thick with the weight of unspoken words. The ink was still wet on phrases that would echo through centuries. We the people, a more perfect union, secure the blessings of liberty, yet the true architecture of the nation taking shape was built as much upon the voids in the text as upon the words themselves. What the Constitution refused to say was a testament not to failure, but to a brutal and calculated design. It was a strategy of omission, a gamble on ambiguity, a form of restraint born of the desperate necessity for survival. The men in that room, having forged a revolution in the crucible of war, now had to forge a government in the crucible of compromise. And compromise, they knew, was often a matter of what is left unsaid. This is the story of those silences. It is an exploration of the questions the farmers refused to answer, the conflicts they buried in euphemism, and the ghosts they locked between the lines of their new republic. It is a historical mystery not of who did what, but of why they did nothing, a mystery of how a nation's founding document could be defined so powerfully by the truths it dared not speak. The mystery deepens when one considers the context in which this document was born. The year 1787 was a moment of profound crisis for the young American Republic. The euphoria of independence had long since faded, replaced by gnawing anxiety about the nation's survival. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at a national government, had proven woefully inadequate. The National Congress had no power to levy taxes, no power to regulate trade between the states, and no power to enforce its own resolutions. It was a government in name only, a hollow shell that commanded neither respect nor obedience. The states, jealous of their newly won sovereignty, treated the national government with contempt. They issued their own currencies, erected tariff barriers against each other's goods, and refused to contribute to the national treasury. The result was economic chaos. Trade was stifled, debts went unpaid, and the value of currency fluctuated wildly. Farmers, crushed by debt and facing foreclosure, rose in armed rebellion. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786, in which a group of debt-ridden farmers attacked courthouses and attempted to seize a federal arsenal, sent shockwaves through the political elite. It was a stark reminder that social order was fragile, that the revolution could still fail, that anarchy was a real and present danger. Against this backdrop of crisis and fear, the delegates gathered in Philadelphia. The 13 colonies had just emerged from a brutal 8-year war against the most powerful empire on earth. They had fought for liberty, for self-determination, for the radical idea that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. The Declaration of Independence, penned 11 years earlier, had been a clarion call of universal human rights, a document that proclaimed, in language of soaring moral clarity, that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. Yet the Constitution, the practical instrument of governance that would give legal form to those ideals, was a document of shadows and silences, of careful evasions and strategic omissions. How did the same generation that produced the Declaration produce a Constitution that refused to name slavery, that left the nature of executive power undefined, that said nothing about the political parties that would soon dominate American life? To understand this paradox is to understand the central tension of the American founding, the gap between the nation's ideals and the political realities that constrained its birth. The summer of 1787 was a sweltering, oppressive season in Philadelphia. The city, which had been the cradle of the Revolution, was now to be the birthplace of a new form of government. Philadelphia in those days was the largest city in the United States, a bustling commercial hub of some 40,000 souls. Its cobblestone streets were crowded with merchants, sailors, artisans, and laborers. The port was alive with the traffic of ships bringing goods from Europe and the Caribbean. The city's taverns and coffeehouses buzzed with political gossip and commercial speculation. But inside the Pennsylvania State House, a different kind of commerce was taking place, the commerce of ideas, of power, of the future of a nation. Inside the State House, in the same room where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier, the heat was a physical presence, a constant torment to the 55 men who had gathered there. The delegates arrived in their finest clothes, silk stockings, powdered wigs, waistcoats, and cravats, attire that was entirely unsuited to the oppressive summer heat. They sweated through long days of debate, their discomfort and a physical manifestation of the task's difficulty. Some delegates, like the elderly Benjamin Franklin, who at 81 was the convention's oldest member, suffered visibly in the heat. Franklin, whose health was failing, had to be carried to the sessions in a sedan chair borne by prisoners from the Walnut Street jail. Yet he rarely missed a day, understanding that this was likely his last great service to his country. By order of the convention, the windows were kept shut and the doors guarded. Secrecy was the first and most inviolable rule. Nothing spoken within those walls was to be repeated outside. The sentries posted at the entrance were not there to keep intruders out, but to keep the delegates' words in. This was a council of ghosts speaking in a sealed chamber, their debates intended to be as ephemeral as the breath that carried them. The decision to meet in secret was not taken lightly. It was a radical departure from the norms of Republican governance, which prized transparency and public deliberation. But the delegates understood that the task before them was too delicate, too fraught with potential for disaster, to be conducted under the scrutiny of the public eye. They needed the freedom to speak candidly, to propose radical ideas, to change their minds, to compromise without being held accountable for every word uttered in the heat of debate. They needed to be able to fail in private before succeeding in public. Secrecy was a protective cocoon, a space where the fragile consensus of a new nation could be nurtured away from the harsh winds of public opinion and political demagoguery. Yet secrecy also carried a cost. It meant that the American people, in whose name the Constitution was being written, had no say in its creation. It meant that the document would emerge fully formed, like Athena from the head of Zeus, to be accepted or rejected as a whole, with no opportunity for the public to shape its contours. It was an act of profound elitism, a decision by a small group of men, however well-intentioned, to remake the government of a nation behind closed doors. The irony was not lost on the delegates themselves. They were creating a republic, a government of the people, in a process that excluded the people entirely. The first silence of the Constitution, then, was the silence of the public voice, the absence of the very people whose consent would be invoked in its opening words. George Washington, the man who had held the Continental Army together through sheer force of will, presided over the convention with a stoic, almost unnerving calm. He sat on a raised dais, in a chair adorned with a carved, gilded sun. The symbolism was not accidental. The sun on the back of his chair was either rising or setting, and no one knew which. It was a perfect metaphor for the convention itself, a moment of profound uncertainty in which the fate of the republic hung in the balance. Washington spoke little during the proceedings. His role was not to argue or persuade, but to embody the gravity and the stakes of the enterprise. He was the silent anchor in a sea of argument, the one man whose presence commanded the respect and deference of all the others. His silence was as powerful as any speech. It was a reminder that the eyes of history and of posterity were upon them. Across the room, a younger man, James Madison of Virginia, sat hunched over a small desk, his quill scratching ceaselessly across page after page. He was not the official secretary, but he had taken upon himself a task of immense and secret importance, to create as complete a record as possible of the debates. He knew, with a historian's foresight, that what was happening in this room was a moment of profound and fragile creation. He positioned himself at front of the chamber, where he could hear every speaker, and he took notes in a kind of shorthand, expanding them each evening into fuller accounts. It was exhausting work, and it took a toll on his health. But Madison understood that the debates themselves were a form of history, a record of the reasoning and the compromises that shaped the final document. Without such a record, future generations would be left to guess at the farmer's intentions, to project their own meanings onto the ambiguous text. Yet even Madison could not capture everything. The whispers in the hallways, the private dinners where bargains were struck, the unspoken understandings that passed between men who had fought and bled together, these were beyond the reach of his pen. His notes, the most complete record we have of the convention, would not be published until 1840, 4 years after his death, ensuring that every man who had been in that room was long dead before their secrets were revealed. This delay was not accidental. Madison knew that publishing the notes while the farmer still lived would be politically explosive. It would reveal the extent of the compromises, the depth of the disagreements, and the contingency of the final product. It would undermine the almost sacred authority the Constitution had acquired in the public mind. And so he chose to protect the myth, believing it was necessary for the Republic's stability. The notes themselves, therefore, are both a window into the convention and a carefully curated artifact, shaped by Madison's own editorial hand and his sense of what posterity should know. The task before the delegates was, by any rational measure, impossible. They had to bind 13 fiercely independent and sovereign states into a single, cohesive nation. These were states that competed economically, that levied taxes on each other's goods, that were deeply suspicious of any centralized authority. The divisions in the room were a microcosm of those in the country. There were large states, like Virginia and Pennsylvania, demanding representation based on population, and the small states, like Delaware and New Jersey, terrified of being swallowed by their larger neighbors and insisting on equal representation for all states. There were the northern states, with their burgeoning commercial economies, and the southern states, whose agrarian wealth was built upon a system of human bondage. There were those who wanted a strong, energetic national government, and those who feared that any such government would inevitably devolve into tyranny. Every man in that room knew that to create a union, they would have to build a bridge across these chasms. The document they were crafting had to be strong enough to hold a nation together, yet flexible enough to be accepted by men who had just thrown off the yoke of a king and were deeply allergic to the scent of tyranny. The Constitution, therefore, could not be a document of ideological purity. It had to be a document of brutal, pragmatic compromise. It had to satisfy everyone just enough, while pleasing no one completely. Its genius would not lie in its perfection, but in its ability to be ratified. The farmers were not ivory tower philosophers, debating the ideal form of government in the abstract. They were politicians in a pressure cooker, trying to forge a workable solution to an urgent and existential crisis. The Articles of Confederation, under which the states had been loosely bound since the end of the war, were a manifest failure. The national government had no power to tax, no power to regulate commerce, and no power to enforce its own laws. The states were on the verge of economic collapse, and there were real fears that the fragile confederation would splinter into 2 or 3 rival nations, leaving them all vulnerable to the predatory empires of Europe. The convention was a last-ditch effort to save the Union. Failure was not an abstract possibility. It was the default outcome if they could not find a way to compromise. And so the first and greatest silence was agreed upon. It concerned the most glaring, most volatile, and most morally fraught issue of their time, slavery. The institution was a living presence in the room. Many of the delegates were slaveholders themselves, their fortunes, their estates, and their way of life inextricably tied to the labor of enslaved people. George Washington owned more than 300 enslaved individuals at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson, though not present at the convention, had built Monticello with slave labor and had fathered children with an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings. James Madison, the architect of the Constitution, owned over 100 slaves. These were not abstract moral questions for them. They were questions that touched the very foundation of their economic and social existence. Others, particularly from the northern states, were morally opposed to slavery, viewing it as a stain upon the ideals of liberty for which they had just fought a revolution. Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, who would later draft the final text of the Constitution, called slavery a nefarious institution and the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. He warned that the admission of slavery into the Constitution would be the most prominent feature in the aristocratic countenance of the proposed Constitution. Yet even Morris, for all his moral fervor, would ultimately bend to the political necessity of compromise. The Southern delegates, led by men like John Rutledge and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina, made their position brutally clear. If the new Constitution threatened their peculiar institution in any way, they would walk out, and the dream of a unified nation would die before it was born. The Northern delegates, for their part, were forced into a terrible calculus. Was a union with slavery better than a union at all? For most, the answer was a reluctant, agonizing yes. They chose the union. They chose it not because they believed slavery was right, but because they believed the alternative, disunion, economic chaos, and vulnerability to foreign powers, was worse. It was a choice made in the shadow of fear and necessity, a choice that would haunt the nation for generations. This choice necessitated a deliberate and strategic act of omission. The words slave and slavery would not appear anywhere in the original text of the Constitution. It was a conscious, collective decision to avoid naming the demon in their midst. Instead, they would rely on a series of carefully constructed euphemisms, a coded language that would allow them to protect the institution without explicitly endorsing it. Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, a man with a keen mind and a wooden leg, the result of a carriage accident, was the chief draftsman of the final document. As head of the Committee of Style, it was his pen that gave the Constitution its final, elegant form. He was personally opposed to slavery, yet it was his task to weave the necessary compromises into the text. He chose his words with the precision of a surgeon, creating a document that could be read one way in Charleston and another in Boston. In Article 1, Section 2, which deals with representation, enslaved people are referred to as other persons. The clause reads, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this Union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons." The language is tortured, deliberately so. Other persons is a euphemism designed to avoid the word slave. It is a linguistic sleight of hand, a way of acknowledging the existence of slavery without giving it a name. In Article 4, Section 2, which contains the Fugitive Slave Clause, the language is similarly evasive. No person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. Again, the word slave is absent. The clause speaks of persons held to service or labor, a phrase that could, in theory, apply to indentured servants as well as slaves, though everyone knew its true purpose. It was a constitutional mandate for the return of fugitive slaves, a federal enforcement mechanism for the institution of slavery, written in language so sanitized that it could almost be mistaken for something else. In Article 1, Section 9, which protected the slave trade for 20 years, the language is even more convoluted. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. Migration or importation of such persons. The phrase is almost comically evasive. Migration suggests voluntary movement. Importation suggests the movement of goods or cargo. The clause manages to protect the international slave trade without ever using the words slave or trade. It is a masterpiece of euphemistic obfuscation. This linguistic gymnastics was not merely a matter of politeness or squeamishness. It was a foundational strategy. By refusing to name slavery, the farmers created a deliberate ambiguity. It allowed pro-slavery delegates to believe the Constitution protected their property, while allowing anti-slavery delegates to argue that the institution was not given a national sanction and could one day be legislated away. It was a way of postponing a conflict they knew they could not resolve. It was a way of saying, in effect, "We will not settle this question now. We will leave it to a future generation." But the silence came at a price. The most infamous of these compromises was the clause that counted 3/5 of the enslaved population for the purposes of congressional representation and taxation. This was not, as is often misunderstood, a declaration that a black person was worth 3/5 of a white person. It was not a philosophical or moral statement about the value of human life. It was a cold political calculation of power. The Southern states had wanted to count their entire enslaved population to maximize their number of seats in the House of Representatives. The Northern states had argued that if slaves were to be considered property, they should not be counted for representation at all. Why should the Southern states get additional political power based on a population that had no political rights, that could not vote, that was held in bondage? It was, they argued, a perverse incentive, a way of rewarding states for the very institution that was most at odds with the principles of the Revolution. The 3/5 compromise was the ugly, cynical result. It gave the Southern states a vastly disproportionate amount of power in the federal government for decades to come, ensuring that the interests of slaveholders would be protected at the highest levels. For every 5 enslaved people, a Southern state would gain 3 additional persons in its population count for the purposes of representation. This meant that states like Virginia and South Carolina with large, enslaved populations, would have far more seats in the House of Representatives than their free populations alone would warrant. And because the number of electoral votes each state received was based on its total number of senators and representatives, the 3/5 compromise also gave the South a significant advantage in the Electoral College, the body that would elect the president. The delegates in that room, even those who hated slavery, knew exactly what they were doing. They were trading moral principles for political unity. They were creating a system in which political power was apportioned based, in part, on the number of people a state held in bondage. It was a devil's bargain that would shape American politics for the next 70 years. It would ensure that slaveholding presidents, slaveholding speakers of the House, and slaveholding Supreme Court justices would dominate the federal government. It would make it nearly impossible to pass any federal legislation that threatened the institution of slavery, because the South had a built-in advantage in both the House and the Electoral College. The silence of the Constitution on the word slavery was not an oversight. It was a bargain. It was the sound of a nation being born with a congenital and perhaps fatal flaw. It was the first and most profound of the things the Constitution refused to say. The delegates themselves were a remarkable and diverse group of men. They included some of the most brilliant minds of their generation, men who had risked their lives and fortunes in the cause of independence. There were lawyers and planters, merchants and soldiers, philosophers and pragmatists. Some, like Alexander Hamilton of New York, were young and ambitious, eager to build a strong national government capable of competing with Europe's great powers. Others, like George Mason of Virginia, were older and more cautious, suspicious of centralized power, and determined to protect the rights of the states and the people. Some were wealthy aristocrats, like Gouverneur Morris, who lived in grand style and moved in the highest circles of society. Others, like Roger Sherman of Connecticut, were self-made men who had risen from humble origins through hard work and native intelligence. The delegates' diversity was both a strength and a weakness. It meant that a wide range of perspectives and interests was represented, but also that finding common ground would be extraordinarily difficult. The debates over slavery at the convention were some of the most heated and divisive. On August 21st and 22, the issue came to a head. Luther Martin of Maryland, a fierce opponent of slavery, argued that the slave trade was inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution and dishonorable to the American character. He proposed that Congress be given the immediate power to ban the importation of slaves. The delegates from South Carolina and Georgia reacted with fury. John Rutledge declared that religion and humanity had nothing to do with this question. Interest alone is the governing principle with nations. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney warned that if the convention attempted to ban the slave trade, South Carolina and Georgia cannot do without slaves. The threat was clear: push too hard on this issue, and the Deep South would walk out. The convention was at an impasse. A committee was formed to find a compromise. The result was a 20-year protection of the slave trade, coupled with the 3/5 compromise. It was a package deal, a set of interlocking concessions designed to keep the Southern states in the Union. Gouverneur Morris, despite his personal opposition to slavery, argued in favor of the compromise on purely pragmatic grounds. He believed that without it, there would be no constitution, and without a constitution, there would be no union. He was willing to sacrifice his moral principles on the altar of political necessity. Not all the delegates agreed. George Mason of Virginia, himself a slaveholder, spoke out against the compromise. He warned that every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant, and that slavery would bring the judgment of heaven on a country. But Mason's warnings went unheeded. The compromise was adopted, and the Constitution was stained from its birth. The psychological weight of this compromise cannot be overstated. These were men who had fought a revolution in the name of liberty. They had declared, in the most famous sentence of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. Yet here they were, writing a constitution that not only tolerated slavery, but actively protected and empowered it. The cognitive dissonance must have been immense. How did they reconcile their ideals with their actions? Some, like Jefferson, engaged in elaborate mental gymnastics, convincing themselves that slavery was a necessary evil that would eventually die out on its own. Others, like Washington, expressed private doubts and discomfort, but ultimately did nothing to challenge the system. Still others, particularly the delegates from the Deep South, felt no such qualms. They saw slavery as a positive good, a natural and necessary part of social order. The silence of the Constitution on slavery was a collective act of moral evasion. It allowed the farmers to avoid confronting the fundamental contradiction at the heart of their new republic. It allowed them to tell themselves that they were creating a government based on the principles of liberty and equality, even as they were enshrining a system of human bondage in its foundational law. It was a silence born of fear, of political calculation, and of a profound failure of moral courage. And it was a silence that would echo through American history, a silence that would only be broken by the thunder of cannons and the blood of 600,000 dead in the Civil War. The bargain struck in the suffocating heat of the Philadelphia summer extended beyond mere representation. It carved out a protected space in time, a 20-year sanctuary for the very practice many delegates privately condemned. Article 1, Section 9, stands as one of the most chilling and revealing passages in the entire document. It states that the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. Here again was the coded language, the careful avoidance of the word slave. But the meaning was unmistakable. The international slave trade, the brutal engine of the Southern economy, was to be given a 2-decade reprieve from federal interference. For 20 years, the ships could continue their horrific voyages across the Atlantic, their holds filled with human cargo, and the new national government would be powerless to stop them. The Middle Passage, that nightmare journey in which millions of Africans had been torn from their homes, chained in the fetid holds of slave ships, and transported across the ocean to a life of bondage, would continue unabated until 1808. What was most remarkable and most terrifying about this clause was its entrenchment. It was one of only 2 provisions in the entire Constitution that was explicitly protected from amendment. Article 5, which lays out the process for amending the Constitution, contains a curious and ominous exception. Provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the 1st and 4th clauses in the 9th section of the 1st article. The 1st clause is the slave trade clause. The farmers, in their wisdom, had created a complex process for altering their creation, but they had placed the slave trade, for a generation, beyond the reach of even that process. It was a non-negotiable demand from the delegates of the Deep South, particularly South Carolina and Georgia, who argued that their states would not ratify the Constitution without it. They needed time, they claimed, to supplement their populations. It was a demand for the rest of the convention, desperate for a union, which ultimately was conceded. The year 1808 must have seemed a distant future to the men in that room, a date far enough away to make the compromise palatable. It was a classic political maneuver: postpone the painful decision, kick the can down the road, and hope that a future generation would have the will to do what they could not. But in doing so, they enshrined a moral poison in the nation's founding charter. They created a constitutional shield for a crime against humanity, a silence that was not merely an omission, but an active 20-year protection of an unspeakable evil. It was the price of the Union, paid in the currency of human lives. The 20-year protection had consequences that extended far beyond 1808. It sent a signal to the world and to the American people that the new national government was not only unwilling to challenge slavery, but was actively complicit in its perpetuation. It gave the institution a legitimacy and a stability it might not otherwise have had. It allowed the Southern states to expand their slave populations dramatically in the years leading up to 1808, knowing that the federal government could not interfere. And when 1808 finally arrived, Congress did pass a law banning the importation of slaves. The domestic slave trade within the United States continued to flourish. The silence of the Constitution had created a space for slavery to grow and entrench itself even more deeply in the fabric of American life. Just as the Constitution was silent on the institution that powered the Southern economy, it was equally silent on the machinery that would soon power its politics. Nowhere in the document will you find any mention of political parties. To the framers, the very idea of parties was anathema, a symptom of disease in the body politic. They referred to them as factions, a term loaded with connotations of selfishness, division, and conspiracy against the public good. James Madison, in his brilliant Federalist No. 10, devoted his entire essay to the mischiefs of faction, arguing that while they were an inevitable byproduct of liberty, their effects must be controlled and mitigated by a well-constructed republic. Madison defined a faction as a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. He saw factions as a threat to the stability and the justice of Republican government. He feared that a majority faction could use its power to oppress the minority, trampling on their rights and pursuing policies that served narrow interests rather than the common good. He feared that minority factions could obstruct the will of the majority and prevent the government from acting in public interest. The solution, he argued, was not to try to eliminate factions. That would require eliminating liberty, but to control their effects through a large, extended republic with a system of representation that would filter and refine the public will. The farmers envisioned a government in which virtuous, disinterested gentlemen would be elected on their own merits and would deliberate for the common good, free from the corrupting influence of party loyalty. They imagined a politics of reason and deliberation, where men of different views could come together, debate the issues, and reach consensus through rational argument. It was a noble, if profoundly naive, vision. It was a vision rooted in the classical Republican tradition, which prized civic virtue and the subordination of private interest to the public good. It was also a vision that reflected the social and political world of the farmers themselves, a world of elite, educated gentlemen who saw themselves as natural leaders and who distrusted the passions and the interests of the common people. The ink was barely dry on the Constitution before the very men who had drafted it began to coalesce into the nation's first political parties. The debates over the ratification of the Constitution itself, and later over the financial policies of Alexander Hamilton, cleaved the political elite into two distinct and warring camps, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists, led by Hamilton and John Adams, favored a strong national government, a broad interpretation of the Constitution, close ties with Britain, and policies that promoted commerce and manufacturing. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, favored a more limited national government, a strict interpretation of the Constitution, sympathy for France, and policies that favored agriculture and the interests of the common farmer. The emergence of these parties was not a gradual, evolutionary process. It was a rapid and often bitter development, driven by fundamental disagreements over the direction of the new nation. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans did not merely disagree on policy, they saw each other as existential threats to the Republic. The Federalists accused the Democratic Republicans of being dangerous radicals, sympathetic to the excesses of the French Revolution and intent on destroying the social order. The Democratic Republicans accused the Federalists of being crypto-monarchists, intent on creating an aristocracy and betraying the principles of the Revolution. The political rhetoric of the 1790s was as vicious and divisive as anything in American history. The Constitution's silence on this matter created a void. It offered no guidance on how parties should be formed, how they should operate, or how they should be regulated. The entire apparatus of modern American politics, the primary elections, the nominating conventions, the party platforms, the vast and complex web of campaign finance, exists entirely outside the framework of the Constitution. It is a shadow government, a second system that grew in the spaces left by the farmers. Their refusal to acknowledge the reality of political parties did not prevent their rise. It simply ensured that, when they did rise, they would do so in an unregulated, often chaotic fashion. The farmers feared that factions would tear the Republic apart, and so they chose not to speak of them. But the silence did not vanquish the threat. It only left the nation unprepared for the form it would take. The Constitution provides no mechanism for regulating political parties, no rules for how they should select their candidates, and no limits on their power or their influence. The result has been a political system in which parties have become the dominant actors, shaping every aspect of American governance, yet operating largely outside the constitutional framework. The silence on political parties is one of the Constitution's most consequential omissions, a void that has been filled by a sprawling, often dysfunctional system of partisan politics that the farmers would scarcely recognize. This deliberate pattern of omission extended into the spiritual realm. The Declaration of Independence, that soaring statement of American ideals, had famously declared that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. It was a document steeped in the language of natural law and divine sanction. It invoked the laws of nature and of nature's God, and appealed to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of its intentions. It closed with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. The Declaration was, in many ways, a theological as well as a political document, grounding the American claim to independence in a higher, transcendent authority. The Constitution, by stark contrast, is a profoundly secular document. There is no mention of God, no appeal to a creator, no reference to divine providence. The only mention of religion at all is prohibition. Article 6, Clause 3, states that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. This was not an oversight. It was a radical and intentional choice. In an age when most nations had an established state church, when religious tests for office were common throughout Europe and even in many American states, the framers chose to build a wall, however porous, between the institutions of government and those of faith. This silence was born of both principle and pragmatism. The framers were, for the most part, men of the Enlightenment, who believed in reason and were suspicious of religious fanaticism that had torn Europe apart for centuries. Many of them were deists, who believed in a distant, impersonal God who had created the universe but did not intervene in human affairs. They were skeptical of organized religion and of any sect's claim to exclusive truth. They believed that religion was a matter of private conscience, not of public law. They were also practical politicians who recognized the immense religious diversity of the 13 states. There were Congregationalists in New England who had their own established churches in Massachusetts and Connecticut. There were Anglicans in the South, particularly in Virginia, where the Church of England had been the established church before the Revolution. There were Quakers and Lutherans in Pennsylvania, Catholics in Maryland, and Baptists and Methodists scattered throughout the country. To have endorsed any single denomination, or even to have enshrined a general deistic faith in the Constitution, would have alienated large segments of the population and doomed the document to failure. And so they chose silence. They created a government that derived its authority not from God, but from we the people. The preamble of the Constitution makes no reference to divine authority. It does not claim that the government is ordained by God or that its powers flow from a higher, transcendent source. Instead, it grounds the legitimacy of the government in the consent of the government, in the will of the people themselves. This was a revolutionary concept, a break with centuries of political tradition that had seen government as a divinely ordained institution. The Constitution created a government that was, in a very real sense, a human creation, a product of reason and deliberation, not of divine revelation. The farmers left the matter of faith to the conscience of the individual and to the authority of the states, many of which still had established churches at the time. The unspoken agreement was that the federal government would be a space of religious neutrality. It would neither promote nor inhibit religion. It would allow all faiths to flourish or decline based on their own merits, without the interference or endorsement of the national government. This was the meaning of the prohibition on religious tests for office. It meant that a person's fitness for public service would be judged by their abilities and character, not by their adherence to any religious creed. It meant that Catholics, Jews, Muslims, atheists, anyone, regardless of their faith or lack thereof, could hold federal office. The silence on God was not an act of atheism, but an act of profound political wisdom, a recognition that in a pluralistic society, the only way to protect religious freedom for all is to grant governmental preference to none. It was a gamble that a nation could be built on a foundation of human reason and mutual consent, rather than on a shared theological creed. It was a gamble that had, for the most part, paid off. The United States has been spared the religious wars that have plagued other nations. It has become a haven for religious diversity, a place where people of all faiths and of no faith can live together in relative peace. But silence has also been a source of ongoing tension. There are those who believe that the framers intended the United States to be a Christian nation, and who see the secular nature of the Constitution as a betrayal of that vision. There are ongoing debates about the role of religion in public life, about prayer in schools, and about religious symbols on public property. The Constitution's silence on God did not settle these questions. It merely deferred them to future generations. Perhaps the most consequential silence, the one that would shape the very nature of American power for centuries to come, concerned the office of the president. Article 2 of the Constitution begins with a sentence of breathtaking vagueness. The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. But what precisely was this executive power, The Constitution does not say. It provides a list of specific duties. The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, shall have the power to make treaties, with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors and judges, also with Senate consent, shall from time to time give Congress information on the state of the Union, and shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. But it offers no overarching theory or definition of the office. It does not explain what executive power means or what its limits are. The delegates to the convention wrestled with the nature of the executive for months. Having just fought a war against a king, they were deeply suspicious of concentrated power. The idea of a single, powerful executive struck many as dangerously monarchical. They debated and voted on the issue more than 60 times. Some delegates proposed a plural executive, a committee of 3, to prevent anyone from becoming too powerful. Edmund Randolph of Virginia argued that a single executive would be the fetus of monarchy. Others argued for a president elected by the national legislature, which would have made the executive a creature of Congress, dependent on the legislative branch for his power and his tenure. The debate over the election method was particularly contentious. Direct popular elections were dismissed by many as both impractical and dangerous, an invitation to what they saw as mob rule. The country was too large, the population too dispersed, for a truly national election, and the farmers, for all their talk of popular sovereignty, were deeply distrustful of the judgment of the common people. They feared that a demagogue could manipulate the passions of the masses and rise to power on a wave of popular enthusiasm. Election by state legislatures was seen as a threat to the power of the national government, as it would make the president beholden to the states rather than to the nation. The result was one of the most complex and least understood mechanisms in the entire Constitution, the Electoral College. It was a compromise born of a deep and abiding distrust of both centralized power and pure democracy. It was a system nobody was particularly happy with, a convoluted contraption designed to filter the popular will through a body of elite, temporary electors. Each state would appoint, in such manner as its legislature directed, several electors equal to its total number of senators and representatives. These electors would then meet in their respective states and cast ballots for president. The person with the most electoral votes would become president. The person with the second highest number would become vice president. The system was designed to ensure that the president would be chosen by a body of wise and deliberative men, not by the direct vote of the people. It was also designed to give smaller states a disproportionate voice in the election, as each state, regardless of size, received 2 electoral votes for its senators, and, crucially, it was amplified by the 3/5 compromise. Because a state's number of electors was based on its total number of representatives and senators, and because the number of representatives was based on population, including 3/5 of the enslaved population, the southern states received a significant boost in the Electoral College. This meant that slaveholding states had a built-in advantage in presidential elections, an advantage that would help elect slaveholding presidents for much of the nation's early history. But why was the nature of presidential power itself left so undefined? The answer lies not in the text, but in the man who was sitting silently at the front of the room. There was an unspoken understanding among all the delegates that George Washington would be the first president. Their trust in him was absolute. They had seen him lead the army through the darkest days of the Revolution, when the cause seemed lost and many were ready to give up. They had seen him hold the army together at Valley Forge through a winter of starvation and disease. They had seen him cross Delaware on Christmas night and turn the tide of the war. They had seen him voluntarily surrender his sword when the war was won, resisting the temptation to seize power and establish himself as a military dictator. They had seen him return to his farm at Mount Vernon, content to live as a private citizen. His act of relinquishing power, more than any of his military victories, had established his reputation as a modern Cincinnatus, the Roman general who had saved the Republic and then returned to his plow. They trusted him to define the office, to set the precedents, to fill in the silences of Article 2 with his own wisdom and restraint. In a sense, they were not creating the presidency, they were creating a vessel for George Washington. This personal trust was a substitute for constitutional clarity. It was a profound gamble, a bet that the character of one man could shape an institution for all time. And, in many ways, the gamble paid off. Washington's presidency established many of the norms and traditions that have governed the office ever since. He established the principle of a 2-term limit, which would not be written into the Constitution until the 22nd Amendment in 1951. He He established the practice of a cabinet of advisors. He established the precedent that the president should be a figure of dignity and restraint, not a demagogue or a tyrant. But the Constitution's silence on the true nature of presidential power has also been a source of ongoing conflict and controversy. It has left a legacy of ambiguity that has been both a source of strength and a source of danger throughout American history. It has allowed the presidency to adapt to changing circumstances, to grow in power during times of crisis. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. Franklin Roosevelt created a vast array of new federal agencies during the Great Depression. Harry Truman sent troops to Korea without a declaration of war. Richard Nixon claimed an absolute executive privilege to withhold information from Congress. George W. Bush authorized warrantless wiretapping in the name of national security. Each of these presidents pushed the boundaries of executive power, claiming authority not explicitly granted in the Constitution, but, they argued, implied by the vague grant of executive power. The Constitution's silence on the presidency is a testament to the framers' faith in one man and a permanent, unresolved question mark at the heart of American government. It is a silence that has allowed the presidency to become the most powerful office in the world, an office whose occupant can launch nuclear weapons, deploy troops around the globe, and shape the course of history with a stroke of a pen. It is also a silence that has left the nation vulnerable to the ambitions of less scrupulous presidents who have used the vagueness of Article 2 to claim powers that the framers never intended. The mystery of presidential power, the question of what executive power truly means, is a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. If the silences of the Constitution were a form of strategic retreat on the most divisive issues of the day, its ambiguities were a form of strategic advance into an unknowable future. The farmers were not merely politicians. They were students of history and architects of a political structure they hoped would endure. They knew, with humility born of their own revolutionary experience, that they could not foresee the challenges a growing nation would face in the centuries to come. To write a document that was too specific, too rigid, would be to condemn it to obsolescence. A government, like a living organism, needed the ability to adapt, and so they wove into the Constitution a series of deliberate and profound ambiguities, phrases that were intentionally elastic, clauses that could be stretched and interpreted to meet the needs of a changing world. This was not a failure of clarity, it was a triumph of foresight. It was the key to the Constitution's remarkable longevity. The most potent of these ambiguities is tucked away at the end of a long list of congressional powers in Article 1, Section 8. After enumerating specific powers to tax, to borrow money, to raise an army, to declare war, to establish post offices, to coin money, the clause grants Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. The necessary and proper clause. It seems, on its face, a simple piece of legislative housekeeping, a grant of implied powers to allow Congress to do what is needed to carry out its explicit duties. But in those two words, necessary and proper, lies a universe of constitutional debate. What precisely does it mean for a law to be necessary? Does it mean essential, without which the government could not function? Or does it mean something more convenient or useful or conducive to the public good? And who decides what is proper? Is it Congress itself, the body exercising the power? Or is it the courts interpreting the Constitution? Or is it the people, through their elected representatives? The text is silent on these questions. It provides no definition, no standard, no guidance. It simply asserts power and leaves its boundaries undefined. The farmers themselves were divided on this question. Men like Alexander Hamilton, who advocated for a strong, energetic national government, saw the clause as a vital source of implied powers. He argued for a broad interpretation, believing that the federal government must have the flexibility to act decisively in the national interest, even if that power is not explicitly spelled out in the text. It was this interpretation that he would later use to justify the creation of a national bank, an institution nowhere mentioned in the Constitution. In 1791, as Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton proposed the creation of the Bank of the United States, a quasi-public institution that would serve as a repository for federal funds, issue currency, and provide loans to the government and to private businesses. It was a cornerstone of his vision for a modern commercial economy. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were horrified at the time. They argued that the creation of a national bank was unconstitutional, that it exceeded the powers granted to Congress in Article 1. They pointed out that the Constitution gave Congress the power to coin money, but not to create a bank. They argued for the strict construction of the necessary and proper clause. They believed necessary meant truly essential, not merely convenient. If Congress could create a bank simply because it was useful, they argued, then there was no limit to federal power. The necessary and proper clause would become a blank check, allowing the government to do anything it pleased. Hamilton responded with a brilliant and influential defense of implied powers. In his opinion on the constitutionality of a national bank, he argued that the word necessary did not mean absolutely indispensable. It meant rather needful, requisite, incidental, useful, or conducive to. He argued that if the end was legitimate, and the Constitution clearly gave Congress the power to collect taxes, borrow money, and regulate commerce, then the means to achieve that end were also legitimate, so long as they were not prohibited by the Constitution. The bank, he argued, was a useful and appropriate means of executing Congress's enumerated powers. It was therefore constitutional. President Washington, faced with conflicting advice from his two most trusted advisors, ultimately sided with Hamilton. He signed the bill creating the Bank of the United States. But the debate did not end there. It persisted throughout the early Republic and reached the Supreme Court in 1819 in the landmark case of McCulloch vs. Maryland. The state of Maryland had attempted to tax the Baltimore branch of the Second Bank of the United States. The first bank's charter had expired in 1811, and a second bank was created in 1816. The bank refused to pay the tax, arguing that a state could not tax a federal institution. The case raised two fundamental questions. Did Congress have the power to create a national bank? And could a state tax a federal institution? Chief Justice John Marshall, writing for a unanimous court, answered both questions in favor of federal power. He embraced Hamilton's broad interpretation of the necessary and proper clause. He wrote, "Let the end be legitimate. Let it be within the scope of the Constitution and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consist with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional." He rejected the strict constructionist view, arguing that limiting Congress to only those powers that were essential would cripple the government and render it incapable of meeting the needs of a growing nation. "We must never forget," he wrote, "that it is a constitution we are expounding, a document intended to endure for ages to come, and consequently to be adapted to the various crises of human affairs." Marshall's opinion in McCulloch was a watershed moment in constitutional history. It established the doctrine of implied powers, the principle that the federal government has not only the powers explicitly granted in the Constitution, but also those reasonably implied by those grants. It gave necessary and proper clause a broad and expansive reading, transforming it from a narrow grant of incidental powers into a vast reservoir of federal authority. It ensured that the Constitution would be a living document, capable of adapting to the nation's changing needs. The silence of the Constitution on the precise meaning of necessary and proper was the engine of constitutional evolution. It allowed the document to grow and change without the need for constant amendment. It allowed future generations to interpret the text considering their own circumstances, to find in its ambiguous phrases the authority to address problems the farmers could never have imagined. This same strategic ambiguity can be found in the clause that gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, and among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. The Commerce Clause, as it came to be known, was a direct response to the economic chaos of the Articles of Confederation, under which states had engaged in destructive trade wars against one another. States had erected tariff barriers, taxed each other's goods, and competed for commercial advantage in ways that threatened the economic unity of the nation. The framers knew that for the United States to survive as a nation, it needed a single, integrated national economy. The Commerce Clause was intended to give Congress the power to break down these barriers and create a free flow of trade across state lines. But what did it mean to regulate commerce among the several states? Did it refer only to the actual goods crossing state lines, the physical act of transportation from one state to another? Or did it extend to the manufacturing of those goods, the labor conditions of the workers who made them, the economic activities within a state that might influence the commerce of other states? The text is, once again, silent. It provides no definition of commerce, no explanation of what it means for commerce to be among the states, and no guidance on the scope or the limits of regulatory power. For the first century of the Republic, the Commerce Clause was interpreted relatively narrowly. The Supreme Court, in cases like Gibbons v. Ogden 1824, established that Congress had broad power to regulate the channels and instrumentalities of interstate commerce, including the rivers, railroads, and telegraph lines that connected the states. But the court was more reluctant to allow Congress to regulate economic activities that took place entirely within a single state, even if those activities might have an indirect effect on interstate commerce. The prevailing view was that manufacturing, agriculture, and labor relations were matters of local concern, to be regulated by the states rather than the federal government. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as the United States transformed into a modern industrial nation, the Supreme Court began to grapple with questions the framers could never have imagined. Could Congress use the Commerce Clause to break up monopolies, to regulate railroad rates, to outlaw child labor, to establish a minimum wage, to protect the rights of workers to organize and bargain collectively? For decades, the answer was often no, as a conservative court clung to a narrow definition of interstate commerce and struck down federal laws as exceeding Congress's authority. The court developed a distinction between commerce and manufacturing, holding that the former could be regulated by Congress, but the latter could not. This distinction, which had no basis in the Constitution, was used to invalidate laws intended to address the social and economic problems of the industrial age. The turning point came during the New Deal in the 1930s amid the Great Depression. President Franklin Roosevelt, frustrated by the court's resistance to his economic recovery programs, threatened to pack the court by adding additional justices who would be more sympathetic to his agenda. The threat was never carried out, but it had its intended effect. In a series of decisions in 1937, the court began to accept a much broader interpretation of the Commerce Clause. In NLRB v. Jones Laughlin Steel Corp., the court upheld the National Labor Relations Act, which gave workers the right to organize and bargain collectively, even though labor relations had traditionally been seen as a matter of local concern. The court reasoned that labor disputes in the steel industry could have a substantial effect on interstate commerce, and therefore Congress had the power to regulate them. In the decades that followed, the interpretation of the Commerce Clause continued to expand. In Wickard-Filburn, 1942, the court upheld a federal law that limited the amount of wheat a farmer could grow, even if the wheat was grown for the farmer's own consumption and never entered interstate commerce. The court reasoned that even purely local activities, if taken in the aggregate, could have a substantial effect on interstate commerce, and therefore could be regulated by Congress. This was the high-water mark of Commerce Clause jurisprudence, a point at which it seemed that Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce was virtually unlimited. This broader interpretation became the constitutional foundation for a vast expansion of federal power, underpinning everything from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which used the Commerce Clause to ban segregation in public accommodations like hotels and restaurants, to modern environmental regulations to federal criminal laws. The farmers, sitting in their sealed room in 1787, could not have envisioned a world of transcontinental railroads, national corporations, global supply chains, or a digital internet economy. But by leaving the definition of commerce ambiguous, they created a tool that could be adapted to regulate them all. The silence on the precise boundaries of commerce among the several states allowed the Constitution to govern a nation of 13 coastal states and a continental superpower of 50, and to extend its reach into areas of life that the farmers would scarcely recognize as commerce at all. This deliberate ambiguity in the granting of federal power was balanced by an equally deliberate ambiguity in its limitation. After the Constitution was drafted, one of the most persistent criticisms against it was that it lacked a Bill of Rights, a clear declaration of the fundamental liberties of the people. The Constitution, as originally written, contained a few specific protections for individual rights: the prohibition on ex post facto laws, the guarantee of habeas corpus, the prohibition on religious tests for office, but it did not contain a comprehensive statement of the rights that the government could not infringe. This was a deliberate choice by the farmers, who believed the bill was unnecessary. They argued that the federal government was one of limited, enumerated powers and had no power to infringe on individual rights because it had not been granted such power. To list specific rights, they feared, might imply that the government had the power to infringe on any rights not listed. But this argument did not satisfy the Anti-Federalists, who saw the lack of a Bill of Rights as a fatal flaw in the Constitution. They feared that without explicit protections, the new national government would inevitably become tyrannical. To secure the ratification of the Constitution, the Federalists promised that the first Congress would propose such a bill. James Madison, who had initially been skeptical of the need for a Bill of Rights, took up the task. He sifted through the various proposals submitted by the state ratifying conventions and drafted a series of amendments. The first Congress approved 12 amendments, 10 of which were ratified by the states and became the Bill of Rights in 1791. The last of these, the 10th Amendment, was intended to be a final, definitive statement on the balance of power between the federal government and the states. It reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." On its surface, it seems a straightforward declaration of states' rights, a constitutional guarantee that the federal government would not exceed its enumerated powers, and that the states would retain their sovereignty over all matters not delegated to the national government. But its power is deceptive, for it hinges on the same ambiguity that runs through the rest of the document. It reserves to the states only those powers not delegated to the federal government. But which powers precisely were delegated? The amendment does not say. It simply points back to the ambiguities of Article 1, to the necessary and proper clause and the commerce clause. It solves nothing. It merely restates the central tension of the federal system without resolving it. This was a deliberate choice. The drafters of the amendment rejected a proposal to insert the word expressly before the word delegated. This would have meant that the federal government had only those powers explicitly spelled out in the text, a victory for the strict constructionists. By leaving expressly out, they left the door open for the doctrine of implied powers. The 10th Amendment, therefore, did not build a solid wall between federal and state authority. It drew a faint and shifting line in the sand. It created a principle of interpretation, a rule of thumb, but it did not settle the fundamental question. It ensured that the debate over the proper balance of power would continue for as long as the Republic itself. And that debate has indeed continued. The 10th Amendment has been invoked by states' rights advocates to challenge federal power. From the nullification crisis of the 1830s to the resistance to desegregation in the 1950s and 1960s to modern challenges to federal health care and environmental laws. But the Supreme Court has generally given the amendment a narrow reading, holding that it is merely a truism, a statement that the federal government has only the powers granted to it, without providing any independent limit on those powers. The silence of the 10th Amendment on the precise boundaries of federal and state power has allowed the balance to shift over time, responding to the political and social needs of each era. Perhaps the most audacious ambiguity in the entire Constitution is not found in any clause, but in the very structure of the government it creates. The document establishes 3 co-equal branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. It gives each branch certain powers and sets them in opposition to one another through a system of checks and balances. Congress makes the laws, the president executes them, and the courts interpret them. Each branch can check the power of the others. Congress can override the presidential veto. The president can veto legislation. The Senate must confirm presidential appointments. The courts can strike down laws as unconstitutional. It is a system designed to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful, to force the branches to cooperate and compromise. But the Constitution is completely silent on who should have the final say over what it means. It never explicitly grants the Supreme Court the power of judicial review, the authority to declare a law passed by Congress and signed by the President to be unconstitutional and therefore void. This power, now seen as the cornerstone of the Supreme Court's authority and the foundation of the Court's role as the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution, is nowhere to be found in the text. Article 3, which establishes the judicial branch, is remarkably brief and vague. It vests the judicial power in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. It defines the jurisdiction of the federal courts, specifying the types of cases they can hear. But it says nothing about the power of judicial review. This power, which has shaped American law and politics for over 2 centuries, was a power the court seized for itself. In the landmark 1803 case of Marbury v. Madison, Chief Justice John Marshall, in a brilliant act of political maneuvering, declared that it was emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. He argued that this power was not a usurpation, but was logically implied by the very nature of a written constitution. If the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, he reasoned, then any ordinary law that conflicts with it must be void, and who but the judiciary could make that determination? It was the court's job to interpret the law, and the Constitution was the highest law. Therefore, the courts must have the power to strike down laws that conflict with the Constitution. It was a masterful argument, but one based on inference and structural logic, not on any explicit textual command. The farmers had debated the idea of a judicial veto over legislation, but they had not agreed on it or written it in the document. Some delegates had proposed giving the Supreme Court the power to review and reject laws, but the proposal had been voted down. The Constitution's silence on this crucial point left a power vacuum. John Marshall, in the early fragile years of the Republic, stepped into that void and claimed the ultimate power of constitutional interpretation for his court. The case itself was a political masterpiece. William Marbury had been appointed as a Justice of the Peace by outgoing President John Adams in the final days of his administration, but the commission had not been delivered before Thomas Jefferson took office, and Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to deliver it. Marbury sued, seeking a writ of mandamus, compelling Madison to deliver the commission. Marshall was in a difficult position. If he ordered Madison to deliver the commission, Madison would likely refuse, and the court would be powerless to enforce its order, revealing its weakness. If he ruled against Marbury, it would look like the court was caving political pressure from the Jefferson administration. Marshall found a third way. He ruled that Marbury had a right to his commission, but that the court could not issue the writ of mandamus, because the law that gave the court that power, Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789, was unconstitutional. The Constitution, he argued, defined the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, the types of cases it could hear directly, without going through lower courts, and Congress could not expand that jurisdiction by statute. Section 13 attempted to do just that, and was therefore void. In one stroke, Marshall asserted the power of judicial review, struck down a federal law, and avoided a direct confrontation with the Jefferson administration. He gave Jefferson what he wanted. Marbury did not get his commission, but he claimed a far greater power for the court in the process. The Constitution's silence on judicial review allowed Marshall to fill it with his own vision of the court's role, and that vision has endured. The power of judicial review is now so deeply embedded in American constitutional law that it is almost impossible to imagine the system without it. The Supreme Court is seen as the final arbiter of constitutional meaning, the institution that has the last word on what the Constitution says and means. But it is a power that was taken, not given, a power that emerged from the silences and ambiguities of the text. It is a silent power, a power that has shaped the course of American history in ways the framers could never have anticipated. It has allowed the court to strike down laws that violated individual rights, from Brown v's Board of Education, which declared school segregation unconstitutional, to Roe v. Wade, which recognized a constitutional right to abortion, later overturned in Dobbs v. Jackson. It has also allowed the court to strike down laws that expanded federal power, from the New Deal-era cases that invalidated economic regulations to more recent cases that have limited Congress's power under the Commerce Clause. The power of judicial review is a testament to the Constitution's silences, to the spaces it left open for future generations to fill. The Constitution was not forged solely by abstract principles of political science. It was the product of human minds, of men burdened by doubt, ambition, and the crushing weight of their own historical moment. To understand the document's silences, one must look beyond the text and into the hearts of the men who wrote it. One must try to imagine the psychological toll of creating a nation on a foundation of compromise, of knowing that the union they were so desperately trying to build was being mortared with moral concessions. These were not distant, impersonal figures from a history textbook. They were flesh and blood human beings, with fears and hopes, with principles and prejudices, with moments of courage and moments of cowardice. The silences of the Constitution are not merely textual phenomena. They are the record of human struggle, of the gap between what men believed and what they were willing to do. No one felt this weight more acutely than James Madison. The slight, soft-spoken Virginian is rightly hailed as the father of the Constitution, but he left Philadelphia in September of 1787 feeling more like a failure. He had come to the convention with a clear and radical vision. a blueprint for a powerful national government that would be capable of overcoming the centrifugal forces that threatened to tear the Union apart. He had proposed the Virginia Plan, which called for a bicameral legislature with representation based on population, a national executive, a national judiciary, and, most importantly to Madison, a federal negative, a power for the national government to veto any and all state laws. This federal negative was, for Madison, not a mere detail. It was the linchpin of his entire constitutional design. He believed it was essential to prevent the states from tearing the Union apart, as they had done under the Articles of Confederation. He had seen the states pass laws that violated the rights of minorities, that interfered with contracts, that erected trade barriers against each other. He believed that the states, left to their own devices, would inevitably pursue their narrow parochial interests at the expense of the common good. The only way to prevent this, he believed, was to give the national government the power to strike down state laws that were unjust or that threatened the harmony of the Union. It was a vision of a truly national government, one that would be supreme over the states in all matters. And he had lost. The smaller states, jealous of their sovereignty and terrified of being dominated by the larger states, had rejected the idea outright. They saw the federal negative as a threat to their very existence, a power that would reduce them to mere administrative units of a centralized government. The convention had instead adopted the Great Compromise, which created a bicameral legislature with representation by population in the House and equal representation for all states in the Senate. It was a compromise that Madison believed was fundamentally flawed, a compromise that preserved too much power for the states and left the national government too weak. The final document was a pale shadow of the centralized republic he had envisioned. In the years immediately following the convention, Madison's letters are filled with foreboding. He feared that the compromises they had made, the powers they had failed to grant the federal government, had doomed the experiment from the start. He had fought and he had compromised, and he believed he had compromised too much. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson in October 1787, shortly after the convention adjourned, Madison wrote with a mixture of hope and anxiety. He defended the Constitution, but he also acknowledged its flaws. He worried that the Senate, with equal representation for all states, would be dominated by the small states and would obstruct the will of the majority. He worried that the lack of a federal negative would allow the states to continue their destructive behavior. He hoped that the new government would work, but he was far from certain. It was only later, as he watched the new government take shape and participate in the very political battles the Constitution's ambiguities made possible, that he began to see the wisdom in what they had created. He came to understand that the document's survival depended not on its rigidity, but on its flexibility. The ambiguities he had once seen as fatal flaws, he now recognized as the necessary breathing room for a growing nation. His own evolution from a champion of federal power to a defender of states' rights during the partisan battles of the 1790s was a testament to the Constitution's capacity to contain and channel profound political disagreement. When the Federalist administration of John Adams passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, laws that criminalized criticism of the government, Madison was outraged. He saw them as a violation of the First Amendment and a dangerous expansion of federal power. He drafted the Virginia Resolutions, which argued that states had the right to interpose themselves between the federal government and the people, when the federal government exceeded its constitutional authority. It was a position that seemed to contradict his earlier nationalism, but Madison saw it as consistent with his core belief in limited government and the protection of individual rights. The Constitution, he had come to believe, was not a fixed and static document, but a framework for ongoing political struggle, a set of rules that allowed different visions of government to compete and coexist. And all the while, he guarded his notes. For nearly 50 years, the most detailed account of the convention's proceedings lay locked away in his personal papers. He edited them, he transcribed them, he added a preface and footnotes, but he refused to publish them. He believed their release, while the farmers and their immediate successors still lived, would be a disservice to the nation. It would reopen old wounds, give ammunition to partisan critics, and undermine the Constitution's almost sacred authority. He knew the difference between the messy, contentious reality of the convention and the myth of a serene gathering of demigods that had taken hold in the public mind. He chose to protect the myth, believing it was necessary for the Republic's stability. When the notes were finally published in 1840, long after the last of the farmers had passed away, they opened a window into that sealed room. But it was a window curated by Madison himself. We can read the words he recorded, but we can never know the full extent of his own editorial choices. What did he soften? What did he omit? What private conversations and backroom deals did he choose to bury forever? Madison's notes are not a neutral, objective record. They are a historical document shaped by the hand of a man who was both a participant in the events he described and a guardian of their legacy. The ultimate mystery of Madison's notes is that the man who recorded the history of the Constitution's creation also had the final say in how that history would be told. The silence of the grave protected the convention's final secrets. We are left to wonder what was said in those private moments, what bargains were struck over dinner and wine, what promises were made that were never written down. The notes are a treasure trove of historical information, but they are also a reminder of the limits of historical knowledge, of the things we can never fully know. If Madison was the architect of the Constitution's ideas, Gouverneur Morris was the poet of its language. A flamboyant and peg-legged aristocrat from Pennsylvania, he had lost his leg in a carriage accident. Though rumors persisted that it was the result of a more scandalous mishap, Morris was perhaps the most outspoken opponent of slavery at the convention. He had railed against it on the convention floor, calling it a curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. He had warned that the admission of slavery into the Constitution would be the most prominent feature in the aristocratic countenance of the proposed Constitution. He had argued that the 3/5 compromise was unjust, that it gave the Southern states undeserved political power based on a population they held in bondage. He had spoken with a moral clarity and a rhetorical force that few others could match. Yet, when the time came to draft the final document, it was Morris, as the head of the Committee of Style and Arrangement, who was tasked with weaving the ugly compromises on slavery into elegant and enduring prose. It was his pen that crafted the euphemisms of other persons and person held to service or labor. We can only imagine the psychological dissonance of that task, the moral compromise required to lend his literary talents to the service of an institution he despised. His personal feelings had to be subordinated to the will of the convention and the desperate need for a union. He was a wordsmith, a craftsman of language, and he used his skills to create a document that could be read in multiple ways, satisfying both the pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, at least enough to secure ratification. It was a form of literary alchemy, turning the base metal of political compromise into the gold of constitutional prose. But Morris's influence went far beyond the crafting of euphemisms. The Committee of Style was not merely a copy-editing service. It took the tangled thicket of resolutions and votes from the convention and gave them their final, coherent shape. And in that process, Morris made subtle but profoundly important changes. The original draft of the preamble, for instance, had begun, "We the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island," and so on, listing each of the 13 states by name. It was a declaration of a compact between sovereign states, a federal union in which the states were the primary actors. Morris, with a stroke of his quill, changed it to the phrase that has defined America ever since, "We the people of the United States." It was a revolutionary act of rhetorical framing. It shifted the source of governmental authority from the states to the nation. It was a vision of national, rather than imperial identity. It suggested that the Constitution was not a compact among the states, but a charter created by a single, unified people. Did he make this change on his own initiative? Or was he acting on an unspoken consensus of the committee? The record is silent. But in that one masterful edit, Morris embedded a nationalist vision into the very first words of the Constitution, a vision that went beyond the compromises and divisions of the convention floor. He used the power of the pen to say what the convention as a whole had not been able to agree upon. It was a vision invoked by Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, when he spoke of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It was a vision used to justify the Union cause in the Civil War, the argument that the nation was indivisible, that secession was not a right but a rebellion. Morris's 3 words, "We the people," have echoed through American history, shaping the way we understand ourselves as a nation. Once the document was signed, the battle for the Constitution was only half over. It now had to be ratified by at least 9 of the 13 states. This was by no means a foregone conclusion. The process of ratification was itself a revolutionary innovation. The farmers had decided that the Constitution would not be submitted to the existing state legislature for approval. They feared that the legislatures, jealous of their own power, would reject any document that created a stronger national government. Instead, they called for special ratifying conventions to be elected in each state. These conventions would be composed of delegates chosen specifically to consider the Constitution. It was a way of appealing directly to the people, over the heads of the existing political establishment. It was also a way of giving the Constitution a democratic legitimacy that it might not otherwise have had. If the Constitution were ratified by conventions elected by the people, it could be said to rest on the consent of the governed, even though the people had had no say in its drafting. The country was deeply divided. The anti-federalists, who opposed the Constitution, were a powerful and vocal force. They were not a unified party with a single platform, but rather a loose coalition of individuals and groups who shared a common fear of centralized power. They included small farmers who feared that a strong national government would favor the interests of wealthy merchants and creditors. They included state politicians who feared that their own power would be diminished by the creation of a national government. They included radical Democrats who believed that the Constitution was insufficiently democratic, that it placed too much power in the hands of a distant elite. And they included principled Republicans who believed that liberty could only be preserved in small, homogeneous communities, and that a large, extended republic would inevitably devolve into tyranny or despotism. They feared that the new government would be too powerful, too aristocratic, too distant from the people, and that it would inevitably devolve into tyranny. They pointed to the lack of a Bill of Rights, the vague and expansive powers granted to Congress, the creation of a single powerful executive, the lifetime tenure of federal judges. They argued that the Constitution was a betrayal of the Revolution, a return to the kind of centralized, oppressive government they had just fought a war to escape. The Anti-Federalists produced a rich body of political writing that articulated their concerns. Writers like Brutus, likely Robert Yates of New York, Cato, likely George Clinton, also of New York, and Federal Farmer, possibly Melancton Smith, published essays that dissected the Constitution clause by clause, warning of the dangers of consolidated power. They argued that the Constitution would create a government too far removed from the people, with representatives from distant states unable to truly understand the needs and interests of local communities. They warned that the federal judiciary, with its lifetime tenure and its power to interpret the Constitution, would become an oligarchy of unelected judges, imposing their will on the people. They warned that the president, with his control of the military and his vague grant of executive power, would inevitably become a king in all but name. They warned that the necessary and proper clause was a blank check, granting Congress unlimited power to do whatever pleased it. And above all, they warned that the lack of a Bill of Rights meant that the fundamental liberties of the people, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the right to trial by jury, were not protected. The ratification debates, which took place in state conventions across the country, were a bare-knuckle political brawl. Pamphlets and newspaper essays flew back and forth, each side accusing the other of the worst motives and the darkest designs. The Anti-Federalists warned of tyranny and oppression. The Federalists warned of anarchy and disunion. It was a battle for the soul of the nation, a debate about the very nature of Republican government. And it was here that the strategic value of the Constitution's silences and ambiguities became most apparent. The document's vagueness allowed its proponents, the Federalists, to tailor their arguments to their specific audiences. In states where there was a strong fear of federal overreach, they could point to the 10th Amendment, part of the Bill of Rights, and argue that the national government's powers were few and strictly limited. In states that desired a strong national economy, they could emphasize the broad potential of the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause. The Constitution could be presented as all things to all people. To the Southerners, it was a document that protected their property in slaves, that gave them disproportionate power in the federal government through the 3/5 Compromise and the Electoral College. To the Northerners, it was a document that avoided any national sanction for the institution, that left the door open for future abolition. To those who feared a strong central government, it was a document of limited, enumerated powers. To those who wanted a strong central government, it was a document with flexibility to meet the needs of a growing nation. The silences allowed different people to hear what they wanted to hear, to project their own hopes and fears onto the text. It was a masterful political strategy, a campaign of deliberate and constructive misinterpretation. The most important and influential defense of the Constitution appeared in a series of essays published in New York newspapers under the pseudonym Publius. These essays, known as the Federalist Papers, were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They intended to persuade the citizens of New York to ratify the Constitution, but they became much more than that. They became a profound and enduring commentary on the nature of Republican government, a work of political philosophy that has shaped American constitutional thought for over 2 centuries. The Federalist Papers are a window into the minds of the farmers, an explanation of the reasoning and the principles that guided their work. But they are also, in a sense, a work of advocacy, an attempt to put the best possible face on a document that was the product of compromise and contingency. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay did not always agree on the interpretation of the Constitution. Hamilton, as we have seen, favored a broad construction of federal power. Madison, at least in the Federalist Papers, argued for a more balanced view, emphasizing the checks and balances and the division of power between the federal government and the states. But they were united in their belief that the Constitution was the best hope for the survival of the Union. They argued that the Articles of Confederation had failed, that the nation was on the brink of collapse, and that only a stronger national government could save it. They defended the compromises, the ambiguities, the silences, as necessary and prudent. They argued that the Constitution was not perfect, but the best that could be achieved under the circumstances. They asked the American people to trust in the wisdom of the framers, to give the new government a chance, and to believe that the experiment in Republican government could succeed. The ratification process was a state-by-state drama, each convention a microcosm of the larger national debate. Delaware was the first to ratify on December 7, 1787, by a unanimous vote. Pennsylvania followed 5 days later, though the vote there was more contentious, with a strong anti-federalist minority. New Jersey and Georgia ratified quickly and unanimously. Connecticut ratified in January 1788, but the real battles were yet to come. Massachusetts, the 6th state to ratify, did so only after a fierce debate and by a narrow margin. The convention was dominated by anti-federalist sentiment, and ratification seemed in doubt. It was only through the skillful politicking of the Federalists and the promise that a Bill of Rights would be added as amendments that the Constitution was narrowly approved. The Massachusetts Compromise, as it came to be known, set a precedent. Other states followed suit, ratifying the Constitution with the understanding that amendments protecting individual rights would be added. Maryland and South Carolina ratified in the spring of 1788. New Hampshire became the crucial 9th state to ratify the Constitution on June 21, 1788, officially adopting it. But the Union was still incomplete. Virginia and New York, 2 of the largest and most important states, had not yet been ratified. Without them, the new government would lack legitimacy and power. The Virginia Convention was a titanic struggle between 2 of the greatest orators of the age, James Madison defending the Constitution and Patrick Henry attacking it. Henry, who had famously declared, "Give me liberty or give me death" during the Revolution, now argued that the Constitution threatened liberty. He spoke for days, his voice thundering through the convention hall, warning of the dangers of consolidated power. Madison, though less charismatic, countered with careful, reasoned arguments, explaining the necessity of a stronger national government. In the end, Virginia ratified by a narrow vote of 9-79. New York followed shortly after, also by a narrow margin. The Union was secured, but the narrow margin of victory was a reminder of how fragile the consensus was. Had the document been more specific, more honest about the hard choices and moral compromises it contained, it likely would never have been ratified. The Union was purchased with the coin of ambiguity. The silences of the Constitution were not merely a literary device, they were a political necessity. They were the grease that allowed the gears of ratification to turn. They were the glue that held together a fragile coalition of states with divergent interests and conflicting visions. The farmers knew that they were creating something imperfect, something that would need to be amended and adapted over time. But they also knew that if they did not create something, if they allowed the Union to dissolve, the experiment in Republican government would be over before it had truly begun. The silences were the price of survival. And what of the things they almost said? The ghosts of rejected ideas and deleted clauses haunt the final text. The most famous of these is the passionate condemnation of the slave trade that Thomas Jefferson had included in his original draft of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson had written, "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty, in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. It was a powerful and unequivocal denunciation of the slave trade, placing the blame squarely on King George III. But the passage was struck from the Continental Congress to appease delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, who were unwilling to condemn the institution. That earlier, failed attempt at moral clarity cast a long shadow over the proceedings in Philadelphia a decade later. The farmers knew which lines could not be crossed, which truths could not be spoken aloud if the Union were to hold. The records of the convention are filled with proposals that were voted down, with ideas that were debated and discarded. There were proposals for a lifetime term for the president, which would have made the office more like a monarchy. There were proposals for the federal government to have the power to create corporations, which would have given Congress even broader economic powers. There were proposals for a council of revision, composed of the president and members of the judiciary, to review all legislation before it became law. Each of these rejected ideas tells a story. They reveal the farmers' anxieties and the boundaries of what they considered politically possible. They are the faint echoes of the Constitution that might have been. The gap between what was debated in that sealed room and what was ultimately written down is a testament to the brutal process of political negotiation. The final document is not a pure expression of political philosophy. It is a battle-scarred survivor, a text shaped as much by the arguments it lost as by the ones it won. It is a monument to the weight of what could not be said. Every clause, every phrase, every word is the result of a choice, a compromise, a calculation of political feasibility. The silences are not empty spaces. They are the record of the debates that could not be resolved, the questions that could not be answered, the truths that could not be spoken. They are the places where the farmers ran up against the limits of their own wisdom, their own courage, and their own political power. They are the places where they choose to leave the question open, to defer the decision to a future generation, to hope that time and circumstance will provide the answer they cannot. History has a way of smoothing over the rough edges of the past. It transforms the messy, contingent, and often ugly process of creation into a clean and inevitable narrative. The Constitution of the United States has been particularly susceptible to this kind of myth-making. We celebrate it as a triumph of Enlightenment reason, a divinely inspired document handed down by a council of demigods. We teach our children about the genius of its checks and balances, the wisdom of its separation of powers. We memorize the soaring poetry of its preamble and hold it up as a beacon of liberty to the world. But in doing so, we often forget that the document's genius lies not only in what it says, but in what it refuses to say. We celebrate the light of the text, but we fail to explore its shadows. To truly understand the Constitution, one must understand the history it chose to forget. We forget the sweltering heat of that Philadelphia summer and the profound secrecy in which the document was born. We forget the bitter arguments, the threats of secession, the deep and abiding distrust that separated the states. We forget that the framers were not a unified chorus, but a fractious assembly of men with competing interests and deeply held, often contradictory principles. And most of all, we forget the price of the Union. We forget the cynical arithmetic of the 3/5 compromise, the 20-year protection for the slave trade, the deliberate erasure of the word slavery from a document dedicated to the blessings of liberty. We forget that the beautiful, enduring edifice of American government was built on a foundation that contained a profound and tragic moral compromise. The silences of the Constitution are not mere footnotes to the story. They are central to the plot. They are the record of the nation's original sin, a sin of omission that would fester for another 7 decades before finally erupting in the cataclysm of the Civil War. The war was, in many ways, a reckoning with the silences of the Constitution, a violent and bloody attempt to resolve the questions the framers had left unanswered. Could a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal continue to tolerate the existence of slavery? Could a union of states survive when half of those states were built on a system of human bondage, and the other half were moving toward free labor? The Constitution had deferred these questions, had buried them in euphemism and ambiguity. The Civil War forced them into the open. The war was the most traumatic event in American history, a conflict that claimed the lives of over 600,000 soldiers and left the nation scarred and divided. It was a war of unprecedented scale and brutality, fought with modern weapons and industrial methods. The battles, Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, Chancellorsville, were slaughterhouses, producing casualty lists that shocked even hardened veterans. The war touched every corner of American life. It transformed the economy as the federal government mobilized resources on a scale never seen. It transformed society as women took on new roles in the workforce and in the war effort. It transformed politics as the Republican Party, founded only a few years before the war, became the dominant political force in the North. And it transformed the Constitution itself, forcing the nation to confront the silences and ambiguities built into the document from the beginning. It was a war fought over the meaning of the Constitution, over the question of whether states had the right to secede from the Union, and over the question of whether the federal government had the power to abolish slavery. The Southern states argued that the Constitution was a compact among sovereign states, and that any state had the right to withdraw from it if it chose. They pointed to the 10th Amendment, to the principle of states' rights, to the original understanding of the farmers. The Northern states, led by Abraham Lincoln, argued that the Constitution created a perpetual union, that secession was not a right but a rebellion, and that the federal government had the power to preserve the Union by force. Lincoln's vision of the Constitution was deeply influenced by the nationalist rhetoric of the preamble, by Morris's 3 words, "We the people." He argued that the nation was not a mere confederation of states, but a single unified people, bound together by a common commitment to the principles of liberty and equality. In his first inaugural address, delivered in March 1861, as the nation teetered on the brink of war, Lincoln argued that the Union is much older than the Constitution. He traced the Union back to the Articles of Association in 1774, to the Declaration of Independence in 1776, to the Articles of Confederation in 1778, and finally to the Constitution in 1787. He argued that the Constitution was intended to form a more perfect union, not to create a mechanism for disunion. He declared that no state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union, and that acts of secession were legally void. The war settled the question of secession by force of arms. The Union was preserved, but at a terrible cost, and in the aftermath of the war, the nation finally confronted the silence at the heart of the Constitution. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, finally broke the original silence. It declared, in language of stark and unambiguous clarity, that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. For the first time, the Constitution used the word slavery. For the first time, it took a clear and unequivocal stand against the institution. The silence was broken. The passage of the 13th Amendment was itself a remarkable achievement, a constitutional revolution that fundamentally altered the nature of American society. It was the first amendment to expand, rather than limit, the power of the federal government. It gave Congress the power to enforce the abolition of slavery through appropriate legislation. It was a direct repudiation of the original Constitution's compromises, a declaration that the nation would no longer tolerate human bondage. But the 13th. The amendment alone was not enough. It abolished slavery, but it did not guarantee the rights of the formerly enslaved. It did not address the question of citizenship or the rights the freed people would have. The Southern states, defeated in war but still determined to maintain white supremacy, passed a series of laws known as the Black Codes, which severely restricted the freedom of the freed people. These laws prohibited Black people from owning land, from testifying in court against white people, and from traveling without permission. They were an attempt to recreate slavery in all but name. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, went even further. It declared that all persons born or naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. It overturned the infamous Dred Scott decision of 1857, in which the Supreme Court had held that people of African descent could never be citizens. It guaranteed that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. It was a promise of equality, a constitutional guarantee that all people, regardless of race, would be entitled to the same rights and the same protections under the law. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited the denial of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Together, these 3 amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, were an attempt to build a new constitutional order on the ashes of the old. They were a direct and forceful repudiation of the founding generation's compromises. They were an attempt to make the Constitution live up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, to create a nation where all men truly were created equal. But the promise of the Reconstruction Amendments was not fully realized. The end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the subsequent rise of Jim Crow segregation in the South meant that the constitutional guarantee of equality remained, for many, an empty promise. It would take another century and another great social movement, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, before the promise of the 14th Amendment began to be fulfilled. Yet even after 27 amendments, many of the original silences remain. The Constitution still says nothing about political parties, the primary elections, or the nominating conventions that determine our political choices. It says nothing about the role of money in politics, or the vast complex system of campaign finance that shapes our democracy in ways the farmers could never have imagined. The Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United v. FEC 2010, which held that corporations have a First Amendment right to spend unlimited amounts of money on political campaigns, was based on an interpretation of the Constitution that the farmers would likely have found baffling. The Constitution says nothing about the filibuster, the Senate rule that allows a minority of members to obstruct the will of the majority, which has been used to block civil rights legislation, judicial appointments, and major policy initiatives. It says nothing about executive privilege, the asserted right of the president to withhold information from Congress and the public, a claim that has been at the center of numerous constitutional crises, from Watergate to the impeachment of Donald Trump. The Jim Crow era, which lasted from the end of Reconstruction until the Civil Rights Movement, was a period in which the promise of the Reconstruction Amendments was systematically betrayed. Southern states used a variety of tactics: literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, outright violence, and intimidation to prevent Black people from voting. They enacted laws mandating racial segregation in schools, transportation, restaurants, hotels, and virtually every other aspect of public life. The Supreme Court, in the infamous case of Plessy-Vartan, Ferguson, 1896, upheld the constitutionality of segregation, declaring that separate but equal facilities did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. It was a decision that would stand for nearly 60 years, a decision that allowed the South to create a system of racial apartheid under the cover of constitutional legitimacy. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s finally challenged this system. Through nonviolent protest, legal challenges, and political organizing, activists like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and countless others forced the nation to confront the gap between its constitutional ideals and its social realities. The Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, which declared school segregation unconstitutional, was a watershed moment. It overturned Plessy and declared that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. The Civil Rights Act of 1960 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were landmark pieces of legislation that used the power of the federal government to dismantle the legal structure of segregation and to protect the voting rights of Black Americans. These achievements were the result of decades of struggle, of sacrifice, of courage in the face of violence and oppression. They were an attempt to finally fulfill the promise of the Reconstruction Amendments, to make the Constitution's guarantee of equality a reality. In many ways, the story of American history has been the struggle to interpret and fill these silences. The document survives not because it is perfect, but because its ambiguities have forced each generation to wrestle with its meaning, to argue about its soul, to remake it in its own image. The silences are the spaces where American democracy happens. They are the places where the Constitution is not a fixed, static rulebook, but a living, evolving framework for political struggle. They are the places where the meaning of the Constitution is contested, negotiated, and redefined. The farmers deliberately created an incomplete document, leaving many questions unanswered. They did so not out of laziness or lack of foresight, but out of recognition that they could not predict the future, that they could not solve all the problems a growing nation would face. They created a framework, not a blueprint. They created a process, not a destination. But what are we to make of the men who created these silences? Was their refusal to confront the issue of slavery an act of profound wisdom or an act of unforgivable cowardice? Was the ambiguity they wove into the text a brilliant strategy for ensuring the document's survival? or a cynical ploy that perpetuated injustice? There are no easy answers to these questions. To condemn the farmers outright is to engage in a kind of historical arrogance, to judge them by standards they could not have shared, to ignore the immense pressures and limited choices they faced. They believed, perhaps rightly, that a union with slavery was the only union possible in 1787. They feared that forcing the issue would splinter the fragile Confederation into 2 or 3 rival nations, leaving them all vulnerable to the predatory empires of Europe. They chose what they saw as the lesser of 2 evils. They created a flawed union in the hope that a future generation, more enlightened and more powerful, could one day make it whole. But to absolve them completely is to ignore the profound human cost of their choices. The silence of the Constitution was not an abstract political strategy. It had victims. It had millions of victims. For the enslaved people of America, the Constitution was not a charter of liberty. It was a document that strengthened the power of their masters, that counted them as 3/5 of a person, for the purpose of empowering the very states that held them in bondage, and that guaranteed the continuation of the brutal slave trade for another 20 years. For women who are not mentioned in the document at all, the Constitution's promise of liberty was one they had no share in. It would take until 1920 and the ratification of the 19th Amendment before women gained the right to vote. For the Native American tribes, who are referred to only as Indians not taxed, the Constitution was the founding charter of a nation that would systematically dispossess them of their lands and destroy their way of life. The phrase Indians not taxed was a way of excluding Native Americans from the political community, of treating them as foreign nations within the borders of the United States. It was a silence that allowed the government to pursue a policy of removal and extermination without constitutional constraint. Justice postponed for those who must suffer its absence is justice denied. The blessings of liberty the Constitution secured were, for a great many people, a distant and unattainable dream. The farmers' decision to prioritize union over justice is one we are still grappling with today. The legacy of slavery, the legacy of exclusion, the legacy of inequality, these are not merely historical curiosities. They are living realities that continue to shape American society. The wealth gap between white and black Americans, the disparities in education and healthcare, the persistence of racial discrimination, these are all in part the legacy of the Constitution's silences, of the choices the framers made in that sealed room in Philadelphia. The Constitution remains a living document, continually interpreted and reinterpreted to meet the needs of a changing society. In recent decades, the Supreme Court has grappled with questions that the farmers could never have imagined. Does the Constitution protect a right to privacy, even though the word privacy appears nowhere in the text? The court said yes in Griswold v. Connecticut, 1965, striking down a law that prohibited the use of contraceptives, and in Roe v. Wade, 1970, recognizing a constitutional right to abortion, though this decision was later overturned in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization in 2022. Does the Equal Protection Clause require states to recognize same-sex marriages? The court said yes in Obergefell v. Hodges, 2015, declaring that the fundamental right to marry extends to same-sex couples. Does the Second Amendment protect an individual right to bear arms? Or does it only protect the right of states to maintain militias? The court said it protects individual rights in District of Columbia v. Heller, 2008, striking down a ban on handguns in Washington, D.C. Each of these decisions was controversial, each sparked intense debate, and each involved the court reading meanings into the Constitution that are not explicitly stated in the text. They are examples of the court filling the silences, of interpreting the ambiguities, of making the Constitution speak to issues the farmers never contemplated. And so the mystery remains. We can read Madison's notes, study the Federalist Papers, and analyze the document itself. But we can never truly penetrate the minds of the men in that sealed room. We cannot know the full extent of their private conversations, the secret bargains struck over dinner and wine, the unspoken assumptions that guided their hands. We cannot know if they truly believed that slavery would wither and die on its own, or if they knew in their hearts that they were merely postponing a day of terrible reckoning. We cannot know if they would be horrified or gratified by the ways in which their ambiguous clauses have been stretched and molded to fit a world they could not have conceived. Did they imagine a nation that would stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a nation of 50 states and over 300 million people? Did they imagine a world of airplanes and automobiles, of computers and the internet, of nuclear weapons and space travel? Did they imagine a nation where women could vote and hold office, where people of all races could be citizens, where same-sex couples could marry. The world we live in is so far removed from the world of 1787 that it is almost unrecognizable. Yet the Constitution they wrote still governs us. It still shapes our politics, our laws, and our understanding of ourselves as a nation. It is a testament to the power of their vision and to the wisdom of their silences. They created a document that was flexible enough to adapt to a changing world, a document that could be interpreted and reinterpreted to meet the needs of each new generation. The deepest secrets of the Constitution died with the men who wrote it. We are left, 2.5 centuries later, as interpreters of their silences, as archaeologists of their omissions. We are left with a document that is both a profound statement of human liberty and a testament to the brutal realities of political compromise. We are left with the enduring, unsettling mystery of what the Constitution refused to say. The silences are not empty spaces. They are filled with the ghosts of the past, with the voices of those who were excluded, with the questions that remain unanswered. They are the places where the Constitution is most alive, most contested, most in need of our attention and our interpretation. It is the central paradox of the American experiment. The nation was founded on a creed of universal liberty, yet its founding document was a compromise with the institution of human slavery. The farmers created a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but they did so in a secret convention, shielded from the view of the very people they claimed to represent. They wrote a constitution whose greatest strength may be the ambiguities that have allowed it to endure, and whose greatest weakness may be the moral compromises that were the price of its creation. Studying the Constitution is to study the human capacity for both soaring idealism and cynical pragmatism. It is to recognize that history is not a clean, simple story, but a tangled, often tragic one. The silence that settled over the Assembly Room in Philadelphia on that September day in 1787 has never truly been broken. It echoes through our history. It reverberates in our politics. It challenges us, even now, to confront the gap between the nation we are and the nation we aspire to be. The mystery of what the farmers left unsaid is, in the end, a mystery about us. It is a question about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget, about what we are willing to confront and what we prefer to ignore. It is a question about the stories we tell about our past and the future we hope to create. The debates over the meaning of the Constitution continue to this day, in courtrooms and legislatures, in classrooms and living rooms, in the halls of power and in the streets. There are debates about fundamental questions. What is the proper role of government? What rights do individuals have? What is the balance between liberty and security, between federal power and state sovereignty, between majority rule and minority rights? These are not questions that can be answered once and for all. They are questions that each generation must grapple with anew, considering its own circumstances and its own values. The Constitution provides a framework for these debates, but it does not provide the answers. The answers must come from us, from the people who live under the Constitution and who give it meaning through our actions and our interpretations. The Constitution is not a perfect document. It never was. It was born in compromise, shaped by necessity, and marked by the silences of its creators. But it has endured. It has survived a civil war, 2 world wars, economic depressions, social upheavals, and profound technological change. It has been amended, interpreted, and reinterpreted. It has been stretched to its limits and beyond. And through it all, it has remained the foundation of American government, the framework within which we conduct our political struggles, the common language we use to debate our differences. The silences of the Constitution are not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature to be understood. They are the spaces that allow the document to live and breathe, to adapt and evolve. They are the places where each generation must make its own choices, must fill in the blanks, must decide what the Constitution means for its own time. The farmers gave us a framework, not a finished product. They gave us a process, not a destination. They gave us a document that asks more questions than it answers, that leaves more unsaid than said. And in doing so, they gave us the responsibility to continue the work they began, to strive toward a more perfect union, to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. The mystery of the Constitution's silences is not a puzzle to be solved, but a challenge to be met. It is a call to each generation to grapple with the fundamental questions of justice, equality, and freedom. It is a reminder that the work of democracy is never finished, that the Constitution is not a static monument but a living document, and that the meaning of "we the people" is something we must continually define and redefine. The ghosts of the Constitutional Convention still walk among us. They are present in every Supreme Court decision, in every act of Congress, in every exercise of presidential power. They are present in the ongoing debates about the scope of federal authority, the rights of states, the limits of executive power, and the meaning of equality. They are present in the silences, in the unanswered questions, in the unresolved tensions. The Constitution is their legacy, but it is also ours. It is a document that belongs to the past and to the future, to the dead and to the living. It is a document that speaks in silences as much as in words, that reveals as much by what it omits as by what it declares. The question of how we should interpret the Constitution remains one of the most contentious in American political life. Should we interpret it according to the farmers' original understanding, trying to discern what they intended when they wrote each clause? This is the approach of originalism championed by justices like Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas. Originalists argue that the Constitution has a fixed meaning, determined by the understanding of those who ratified it, and that judges should not impose their own values or policy preferences on the text. They see the Constitution as a contract whose terms were agreed upon at a specific moment in history and should be interpreted according to the understanding of the parties to that contract. But originalism has its critics. They argue that it is impossible to recover the original understanding with any certainty, that the farmers themselves disagreed with the meaning of many clauses, and that a strict adherence to the original understanding would freeze the Constitution in the 18th century, making it unable to address the problems of the modern world. They advocate for a living constitutionalism, an approach that sees the Constitution as a document that evolves over time, whose meaning changes to reflect the values and needs of each new generation. Living constitutionalists argue that the framers wrote in broad, general terms, precisely because they wanted the Constitution to be adaptable, and that it is the job of each generation to interpret those terms, considering contemporary circumstances. This debate is not merely academic. It has profound practical consequences. It determines how the Supreme Court decides cases, how Congress exercises its powers, and how the president interprets his authority. It shapes the very nature of American government and American society. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Constitution's silences, that the most important truths are often the ones that cannot be fully articulated, that the deepest wisdom lies in knowing what to leave unsaid. The farmers understood that they could not solve all the problems of their time, let alone the problems of future generations. They understood that to try to do so would be an act of hubris, an attempt to impose their will on a future they could not foresee. And so they chose restraint. They chose to leave certain questions open, to create a framework rather than a blueprint, to trust that future generations would have the wisdom and the courage to fill the silence. Whether that trust was justified is a question each generation must answer for itself. The Constitution has survived for over 2 centuries, but its survival has not been inevitable. It has required the constant vigilance and the active participation of the American people. It has required a willingness to grapple with difficult questions, to confront uncomfortable truths, to engage in the messy, contentious, and often frustrating work of democratic governance. The silences of the Constitution are not an excuse for inaction, but a call to action. They are a reminder that the work of building a more perfect union is never finished, that each generation must take up the task anew. The men who gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 created something remarkable. They created a government that has endured longer than almost any other written constitution in the world. They created a framework for democracy that has inspired nations around the globe. But they also created a document marked by profound silences, moral compromises, and unanswered questions. To honor their legacy is not to worship them as infallible demigods, but to recognize them as flawed human beings who did the best they could under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. It is to acknowledge both the brilliance of their achievement and the limitations of their vision. It is to understand that the Constitution they created is not a finished product, but a work in progress, a document that each generation must interpret and reinterpret, a framework that each generation must fill with its own meaning. The Constitution's silence also raises profound questions about the nature of political authority and the legitimacy of government. If the Constitution derives its authority from "we the people," as the preamble declares, then who exactly are the people? In 1787, the people did not include enslaved people, who were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, but had no political rights. It did not include women who could not vote or hold office. It did not include Native Americans who were excluded from the political community. It did not include men without property, many of whom were also denied the right to vote by state laws. The people who ratified the Constitution were a small fraction of the total population, a privileged elite of white property-owning men. Does this undermine the legitimacy of the Constitution? Or does the fact that the Constitution has been amended over time to expand the definition of the people, to include formerly enslaved persons, women, Native Americans, and all citizens regardless of property ownership, give it a renewed and more inclusive legitimacy? These are not easy questions, and they go to the heart of what it means to have a government based on popular sovereignty. The silences of the Constitution force us to confront these questions, to think deeply about the foundations of our political system, and to recognize that the work of creating a truly inclusive democracy is an ongoing project, not a finished achievement. The mystery of what the Constitution refused to say will never be fully solved. The secrets of that sealed room in Philadelphia, the private conversations and unspoken understandings, the hopes and fears of the men who created our founding document, these are lost to history. But the legacy of their silences lives on. It lives on in the ongoing debates about the meaning of the Constitution, in the struggles for justice and equality, and in the constant tension between the ideals we profess and the realities we confront. The silences are not a void, but a space for interpretation, for debate, for growth. They are the reasons the Constitution has endured and continues to matter. In the end, the story of the Constitution's silences is a story about the human condition. It is a story about the gap between our ideals and our actions, about the compromises we make in the face of necessity, about the things we choose to say and the things we choose to leave unsaid. It is a story about the weight of history, the burden of the past, and the responsibility for the present. It is a story that reminds us that the work of building a just and free society is never finished, that each generation must take up the task anew, and that the silences of the past are not obstacles to be overcome, but spaces to be filled with our own voices, our own struggles, our own hopes for the future. The Constitution refused to say many things. It refused to name slavery. It refused to define executive power. It refused to acknowledge political parties. It refused to invoke God. It refused to settle the balance between federal and state authority. These refusals were not accidents. They were choices, deliberate and strategic, made by men who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to remain silent, to leave a question open, to trust that the future will provide the answer you cannot. The silence of the Constitution is its most profound and enduring feature. They are the spaces where democracy lives, where each generation must make its own choices, where the meaning of we the people is continually contested and redefined. They are the reasons the Constitution has survived and will continue to shape our nation for generations to come. The farmers' decision to leave so much unsaid was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. It was recognition that they were creating a government for a nation that would grow and change in ways they could not predict. They were creating a document that would have to serve not just their own generation, but generations yet unborn. They could not know what challenges those future generations would face, what technologies they would develop, what values they would hold. And so they wrote a document that was intentionally flexible, that left room for interpretation and adaptation. They created a constitution that could grow with the nation, that could be stretched and molded to fit new circumstances. This flexibility has been both a blessing and a curse. It has allowed the Constitution to survive for over 2 centuries, to govern a nation that has grown from 13 states hugging the Atlantic coast to 50 states spanning a continent. It has allowed the Constitution to adapt to the Industrial Revolution, to the rise of the modern administrative state, to the challenges of the Cold War and the War on Terror. But it has also created uncertainty and conflict. The ambiguities of the Constitution have been the source of countless legal battles, political controversies, and even a civil war. The silences have been filled in different ways by different people, leading to fundamentally different visions of what the Constitution means and what kind of nation America should be. The Constitution's silences also reflect a deeper truth about the nature of political life, that some questions cannot be answered definitively, that some conflicts cannot be resolved once and for all, that some tensions are inherent in the very project of democratic self-government. The tension between liberty and equality, between individual rights and the common good, between federal power and state sovereignty, between majority rule and minority rights. These are not problems that can be solved by clever constitutional drafting. They are permanent features of political life, dilemmas that each generation must navigate in its own way. The farmers, in their wisdom, understood this. They did not try to impose a single final answer to these questions. Instead, they created a framework for ongoing debate and deliberation, a process through which these tensions could be managed and balanced. The silences of the Constitution are the spaces where this process takes place, where the American people, through their elected representatives and their courts, work out the meaning of their fundamental law. The story of the Constitution is, in many ways, the story of America itself. It is a story of high ideals and brutal compromises, of soaring rhetoric and ugly realities, of progress and setbacks, of hope and disappointment. It is a story of a nation that was founded on the principle of human equality, but built on the foundation of human slavery. It is a story of a people who proclaim their commitment to liberty while denying that liberty to millions. It is a story of a democracy created by an elite few behind closed doors, yet one that has gradually expanded to include more of its citizens. It is a story of a document that has been both a charter of freedom and a tool of oppression, both a source of inspiration and a source of frustration. The Constitution is not a simple or straightforward document. It is complex, contradictory, and deeply human. It reflects the best and the worst of the men who created it, and of the nation they founded. As we look back on the Constitutional Convention of 1787, we can see it as a moment of both triumph and tragedy. The triumph was the creation of a framework for government that has proven remarkably durable and adaptable, allowing the United States to become one of the most powerful and prosperous nations in the world. The tragedy was the moral compromises that were necessary to achieve that framework, the decision to protect and empower the institution of slavery, and the exclusion of so many people from the promise of liberty and equality. We cannot undo those compromises, cannot erase that history, but we can learn from it. We can recognize that the Constitution is not a perfect document, that it was created by imperfect people in imperfect circumstances. We can acknowledge the silences and omissions, the things left unsaid, and the people left out. And we can commit ourselves to the ongoing work of making the Constitution live up to its highest ideals, of expanding the circle of we the people to include everyone, of securing the blessings of liberty for all. The Constitution has been amended 27 times since its ratification, each amendment a response to the changing needs and values of the American people. The first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, were added almost immediately to address concerns that the new government would threaten individual liberties. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, were added after the Civil War to abolish slavery and guarantee equal rights to all citizens. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. The 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax, which had been used to disenfranchise black voters in the South. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. Each of these amendments represents a step forward in the long march toward a more inclusive and more just democracy. Each represents an attempt to fill the silences of the original Constitution, to say what the farmers could not or would not say. But the amendment process is difficult and slow. It requires a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, or a convention called by 2/3 of the state legislatures, followed by ratification by 3/4 of the states. This high bar for amendment means that the Constitution changes only when there is a broad and sustained consensus for change. It means that many of the silences and ambiguities of the original document remain, waiting to be interpreted and reinterpreted by each new generation. The Constitution is not just a legal document. It is also a symbol, a statement of national identity, a source of civic pride and civic debate. Americans have a deep and abiding reverence for the Constitution, a sense that it is something sacred and inviolable. This reverence can be a source of strength, a reminder of the principles and values that unite us as a nation. But it can also be a source of complacency, a tendency to see the Constitution as perfect and unchangeable, to resist any criticism or any call for reform. The challenge for each generation is to balance reverence with critical engagement, to honor the Constitution while also recognizing its flaws and its limitations. We must be willing to ask hard questions about the Constitution, to examine its silences and its compromises, to confront the gap between its ideals and its realities. We must be willing to engage in the difficult work of interpretation and reinterpretation, to make the Constitution speak to the needs and values of our own time. The framers gave us a Constitution, but they also gave us a responsibility. They gave us the responsibility to preserve and protect the Constitution, to defend it against its enemies, to interpret it faithfully and wisely. But they also gave us the responsibility to improve it, to amend it when necessary, to fill in its silence, to make it a more perfect instrument of justice and liberty. This is the work of every generation of Americans. It is the work of citizens who vote and protest and organize, of legislators who debate and compromise and pass laws, of judges who interpret and apply the Constitution to new and unforeseen circumstances. It is the work of all of us, as members of We the People, to give meaning to the Constitution, to make it a living reality rather than a dead letter. The silence of the Constitution is a challenge and an invitation. They challenge us to think deeply about the fundamental questions of political life and to grapple with the tensions and contradictions inherent in the project of democratic self-government. They invite us to participate in the ongoing conversation about what the Constitution means, adding our voices to the chorus of interpretation and debate that has been ongoing since 1787. The Constitution is not a monologue, but a dialogue. It is not a finished statement, but an ongoing conversation. It is not the property of the framers alone, but the common inheritance of all Americans. The silences are the spaces where we enter that conversation, make our own contributions, and shape the meaning of the Constitution for our time and the future. If this story has awakened something in you, if it has resonated with the truth in your own heart, then our journey together has just begun. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and prepare yourself. For there are many more echoes to be heard, many more mysteries to be solved, and a great, glorious future to be won. The age of humanity is dawning, and it will be an age of wonders. Please subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat